So I'm here to talk to you about the Conditional Orchestra, which is a personal project of mine that took almost 2 years to make because I did it in my spare time, evenings, weekends, the occasional holiday day taken to work on it. So I want to thank my wife for being incredibly patient during this time. This is probably the last personal project I'll do for a few years. She can be reassured. And what it is it's a web app that converts weather data to music. I will explain more shortly. So, just a tiny bit about me first. As Andy said, my name is Richard Bultitude, unusual surname perhaps. My main interests are art and technology, amongst other things. And this project is very much about bringing those two worlds together. I recently started a new job at Sapient Razorfish, who, if you've not heard of them, are like a a global consultancy / agency. So yeah, I've only been there 3 weeks, and I can't tell you too much about them. I'm not going to oversell them, but yeah, I'm enjoying it so far. It's a good place. I'm also a musician. In my spare time, I've put out a few records over the years. The one in the top left was my first record back in 2004. Most of my music came out under the name of Point B, but I've also recorded as Planes and Frond, the latter of which is probably the project which most closely matches what the Conditional Orchestra sounds like, which we will hear later. So yeah, onto the actual project itself. So as I say, it's a web app that converts weather data into music, and the question that's maybe begging is, why on earth did I come up with that idea? So quite a while ago, I came across this. I haven't actually been there, but this is Zadar in Croatia. Maybe some of you in here know this and have been there, in which case you're very lucky. So it's a piece of, I guess, public coastal architecture that uses the movement of waves to make music. So the waves lap against the shore, which is the piece of architecture, and they force air through a series of chambers, and that produces a sound. And I find this really, really inspiring. So let's have a little listen. I mean, I find it really, really charming and beguiling, but a friend of mine did say it sounded like someone playing like the pan flute really badly. So it's a matter of taste. But I really, really liked the idea that, you know, one natural force was being converted into something else. And I kind of like the fact that the sound that you hear is an analog of the waves themselves. So I really love that project, and that kind of set some initial thoughts going. And around that time, I was starting to explore generative music, which is essentially music whereby you create a system that generates music rather than actually writing it as score or programming it, sequencing it. And I wrote a blog series on how to do it using this particular piece of software called Reason, which is a music editor. And I was really enjoying the idea of kind of creating sounds that I couldn't really normally imagine by using randomness and sort of allowing the system to have some freedom in it. But the actual sources were essentially just oscillators. They're things that produce numbers underneath, and I sort of didn't like the fact that, or I didn't really feel like pursuing that because it wasn't connected to the outside world in any way. So going back to what I said about the sea organ, I kind of started to think about how I could somehow incorporate forces of nature or the weather into some kind of generative music system. The weather's going to be a bit of a winner in this respect, right? Because, it's something we all experience, and it's always changing. So it's a really good data source in that respect if you want to make crazy music. So I had to kind of think about how I was actually going to go about it. And I don't mean from a technical perspective, but what two things am I going to join? And over the last 5 years, I've gone to Resonate Festival, conference/festival in Belgrade, which if you don't know it, I'd really recommend. It's a really inspiring event about digital culture, lots of fascinating speakers. Some of them kind of do, some of them are artists, some of them are lecturers, some of them are technicians. But there's a guy that spoke there called James Bridle, who's a really interesting character. And he had this project called A Ship Adrift. It's probably one of the more simple and slightly sort of superficial projects that he's done. But something about it really charmed me. So just, if that picture won't make sense yet. Does anyone recognize this? So this is on the South Bank. This is a hotel room that you can actually rent. So I think you can still rent it. But yeah, it's a boat on the South Bank Centre. And you'll notice at this point when this picture was taken that it's got essentially a kind of simple weather station on the roof. So James Bridle decided to use this to do something interesting with it. So he took the wind speed and the wind bearing or direction, and he plotted what this ship would do if it were to sail across the world, which now should explain the map. So it's really sweet. This thing set sail over a year, 365 days, and it made its way all the way down to Australia. And he formed a real emotional attachment to it. He watched this thing move slowly but surely every day. I just really liked the idea that you had two simple data inputs and you could do something extraordinary with them. So I said, okay, this is my starting point now. So I'm going to take wind speed and map that to the volume of a sound, and I'm going to take the bearing and map that to the pitch. And initially, I just those ranges, I just settled on something just to get myself started, and there wasn't a lot of creative process to this. But it took me to an interesting place. So my prototype for the Conditional Orchestra was a little project I called the Musical Weather Vane, and it was completely static. It got live data, but the 3 points were just static. I just thought, okay, can I play a chord using the wind bearing and speed from 3 different locations? So I hooked it up to whatever it says here, Montevideo in Uruguay and Tokyo and Cape Town, and it produced this. Which, depending what you're into, is either really good or kind of slightly dissonant and unpleasant. But it was an interesting starting point. I had some data and I had some sounds, and so I was kind of starting to think about, okay, I was starting to see in my mind that I had to design something pretty sophisticated to play music that that is more either describes the weather better or is actually just more aesthetically pleasing. But it was a start. So just a slight detour. I'm just going to explain quickly how I got that working and what I've used to make the Conditional Orchestra. Actually, let me skip ahead slightly. So there's a creative coding framework called Processing, which is a Java-based framework. It's been going for 12 years now, I think. And I've done a few courses on it and things, and it's a really powerful tool. You can do 3D, and you can kind of marry audio and visual, and you can do some really exciting, extraordinary things with it. But it's based on a very simple premise. You could previously publish to Canvas. It would write JavaScript for you from the Java. It would parse it all, but it was pretty awful. It wasn't really what it was built for. So a very lovely person called Lauren McCarthy took the immense time and trouble to port it properly to JavaScript and called it P5. By the way, if anyone gets to see Lauren McCarthy speak, I would really recommend it. She's a really, really inspiring and interesting person. She's technical, but she's done a lot of really, really interesting and really funny, slightly Black Mirror-esque projects. So yeah, check out her work. She's awesome. So just quickly explain the very bare bones of processing, or P5. So 3 sort of fundamental methods. Firstly, you have preload, which kind of speaks for itself. So I'm going to load a sound. One of them actually you just heard. And when that is ready, it's going to move to the setup. This is where I get to set things like frame rate. And then we're going to enter a draw loop, and that's just going to loop forever until I stop it. And what's nice is this lends itself very easily to OO style programming. Excuse the ES5 folks, but you know, I wrote this a little while ago. Weird things to have to apologize for, right? So this constructor is one node in my spiral. So it's got some properties and some stuff that's been set from the beginning. And then I have these 2 really important methods that I've added to it: paint and update. Paint is going to draw something on my canvas, and update is where I can write my algorithms and so on, and actually make stuff move around. So yeah, that's my object. And then if we go back to the setup and draw, in my setup, I create my canvas, I attach it to something, I set a background color, I make my array for my spiral out of all those nodes that I just showed you, and then I can just loop through them all in the draw, and I paint onto the canvas and I update and they move. So that's the basic premise. This is pretty much the product of that code. I just wanted to quickly show you how easy it is to think and work in that way. So yeah, I've got a few of these on GitHub, which you can check out if you're interested. So I had the musical weather vane, and I needed to take that idea further. I really didn't want it to be a passive thing. I wanted, you know, whatever it was going to be, it had to have the user as an important part of it, right? I don't want you just listening to a bunch of places that I've picked. So I suppose the obvious next step is perhaps fairly obvious. So I kind of need to think about the main call to action. So I thought to myself, okay, well, let's just keep it really, really simple. Let's just ask people, play my weather. So it's going to look up your location, should you allow it. If you don't, you're going to have to find some other way to play the music. And it will go and fetch the weather data, and it will map all of those data points to different facets of the music, and it will play you something that evokes the weather. That was the idea. So I thought that was good enough to begin with, and I kind of started to shape that, and I did a lot of hacking. I made the classic mistake of not really planning the application properly from the beginning and hacking to get it work out of excitement, and I probably spent a year undoing lots of that hacking, but I had fun, sort of. And then I thought, okay, yeah, you know, they give the people what they want, right? They're going to want to put their own location in. They're going to want to be able to listen to the music of the world. So I added a simple form which does some reverse geocoding, thanks to Google, and you know, you can put anywhere you want in there. So tiny bit about the data points that I used. So initially, I just mapped each of these available points to one particular aspect of the music, and then I very quickly ran out of ways to actually make the music sophisticated enough. So I had to use combinations of these to infer new weather conditions. So for example, fog, you know, that's, if I remember correctly, the difference, or it's when there's less than 4 degrees between humidity or the humidity point, the dew point, and the temperature. And I can, from that, or if I haven't got that, from the visibility that day, I can kind of infer that it's foggy or you know, or misty. So, you know, I would create something like that out of these, and then I would assign that to another aspect of the music. And I had to do that over and over again until I was happy with the music, which took an enormous amount of time and a lot of testing. But it was worth it because the music had to be good. So yeah, a really obvious example of a direct mapping would be, you know, that I used pressure to determine what the root note is. So the lower the pressure, the lower the whole thing plays in, and the higher the pressure, the higher the whole thing plays in. And the service that I used to get the weather data is Dark Sky, formerly Forecast.io. Very kindly, they completely rebranded during me making this, so a few things needed to be updated, and they added some new data points, and they changed a few bits and bobs, but it was all good. So on their site was a list of the official JavaScript wrappers, wrappers in any language, and there was one listed for JavaScript, which I began to use, and I kind of got talking to the guy that wrote it, who I'm still really grateful to because he got me going on this, but he admitted himself that he wasn't a hardcore developer and that it probably had a few possible enhancements, being diplomatic. One of the things that was up with it was that when it was handling a request, and it can only handle one at a time, it completely blocked the main thread. It wasn't asynchronous. So I rewrote a lot of it. I made it promise-based, and you can use as many points as you want. I fixed a few things up, and he let me be a core contributor. And it was my first proper foray into actually contributing to something meaningful out there, and that was really nice, even though it was a tangent. And I was like, oh, for God's sake, I just want to make the damn project. Actually, it was really important for me to give something back, and I think he really appreciated someone giving the library attention. Since then, I have actually written some code which breaks the original, so I've published my own version of it. He was cool about it. I kind of felt like it needed to be done. There was variable names and function names that didn't match, so you couldn't loop through them. Without going into too much detail, I published my own. It's on NPM. It did pretty well. It got quite a few downloads and got some good feedback. No issues so far, but then I'm promoting it now, so hopefully one of you guys will find something I can fix it. That would be fun. It was an interesting lesson in this, and a couple of the people have mentioned this at Front End London, that if you're going to publish something like this, make the documentation really good and write unit tests. Those would be my 2 tips. I think from that, because the documentation is thorough and because I know that it's fairly robust, I've not had many issues, and it's all been good. So I thought, okay, cool, I can just carry on with making the music now. This is going to be great. I'm just going to make some music using web audio. And then I was like, no, actually, hang on. What I want to do isn't quite what lots of other people are doing. So the way web audio works is that you can create an oscillator. So that's just something that's going to produce a wave of some kind, a sine wave, a sawtooth wave. It's going to make a noise. And you can essentially pump into it a number, and that number corresponds to a real frequency in hertz. So 440 would be the note A. Brilliant. But what I wanted to do is I wanted to use audio files of my own. I'm a musician as well, and I wanted to use texture, and I wanted to make the music more interesting. Basically, oscillators are quite simple, I suppose. So the way that works is that the frequency 1 is the root note of that file it's playing. So to go an octave higher, you have to double it. To go an octave lower, you have to halve it. And now you start, maybe you can see where I'm going with this, but you start to get into some slightly heavier maths, and there weren't libraries out there that really did what I was looking for. I just wanted to be able to pitch an audio file up and down to the right note that I wanted. So I went off on another tangent, which was probably about 5 months or something, writing my own audio engine, which was another amazing adventure. I had to learn a lot more about music theory than I expected. The first thing I encountered was that actually there's 2 systems for the way music actually works. There's one in nature, which is, let me think, what's it called? Equal temperament, I think. Anyone want to help me out with this? Basically, the 2 different systems work slightly differently. In nature, the what's that? Pythagorean? Yeah, ratios, right? Yeah. So one system is ratios, and that's some pretty heavy stuff to write yourself. And also, the notes that are actually produced in nature are slightly discordant. People actually aren't used to them anymore. Nearly all music is written in a new system, a tempered system. That's how a kind of keyboard works. They're just divided up. So there's a formula for that, and the formula is reasonably straightforward, but I basically use that as the basis for the kind of audio engine that I needed to write. And actually, as with all these things, if you write something yourself and you've got a really clear idea what problems it solves, you can make it do stuff that other people's can't. So I called it Freaky. I was well chuffed that name was available. And I built in some features that I'm quite proud of. So you can create as many notes as you want. It basically gives you an array of frequencies. You can kind of offset it. So if you're making lots and lots of different chords and scales and things, you can kind of keep offsetting it and changing the root note. And it's really flexible in lots of ways. So just a quick look at the API. So there's one method really that you would use, and it's just going to get you this array that you can play with. And there's two mandatory arguments. So the actual start frequency, which if you remember from the other slide, it could be a frequency in hertz, or it could be the number, the relative frequency. And then, the stuff that you want. What notes do you want? So I want I want note 0, note 3, and note 5. Is that a minor scale? Anyone?
Major.
Is it major? Yeah, of course it is. Yeah, thank you. I know what I'm talking about now, honestly. And there's a load of optional arguments. Well, I say a load. There's 3. Number of semitones, which is the most interesting one for me, because in normal Western music, there's 12 notes in an octave. But with this, you can say however many you want. So it will divide an octave up into as many notes as you like, which means you can make crazy music, basically, really far out music. Or you can make music more easily that is closer to things like the Indian scales. But it gives you that flexibility. You can just decide how you divide up frequencies, basically, which I thought was useful, and I actually did use in this application. So going back to actually what I was making, I had something that kind of worked and that I was starting to get happy with, but the most important thing to do at this point, before you go any further, right, kids, is to ask for feedback, because you don't know if what you've made is actually awful, or it's just got some enhancements that are going to make the experience better. That's how I should have expressed it originally. So a really interesting point in the process is for me, because I just thought, okay, you've got 2 buttons, you can do what you want, you can listen to this music, you can listen to your weather. That's pretty cool, isn't it? And people are like, yeah, that's cool, but how the hell does it work? Like, one friend of mine even said to me, do I even know that you're really doing it? I was like, what do you think it's doing? He's like, well, is it just playing back a track that you've written? How cynical is that? That's terrible. Of course it's bloody real. It took me a year to get to this point. Anyway, so the feedback was, how do we kind of see inside this? How do we understand what facets of the weather are being mapped to what sound? And actually, having slept on it, I was like, that's actually a good point, right? You want to see what's going on. Fair enough. Okay, I'll set aside another 2 or 3 months. What I realized I was about to do was something really strange in our world, right? Normally, you wouldn't want to expose what an application is doing underneath, Really? Like, normally people want content, or they want to perform an action, right? They want to complete a task. Whereas, I needed to kind of show people that, I guess, the inner workings are the content. So I designed a simple sort of card system where you can clearly see what the condition is that I'm using, and I had to sort of friendlyify some of these, do some text processing, what it's doing to the music, and and I give you a nice icon. I mean, I give some values here and there, and for Booleans, I just leave it out altogether. I just omit it. And I used handlebars to do this, and I kind of I didn't make it too fussy, but I just had a way of kind of mapping that data that made sense for both the music and the visual. But I had to do a lot of unpicking and a lot of refactoring to get to this, because the way I'd written everything was just to work with the music. So I now had to kind of make it agnostic to that. So add another month, and I was at a place where I could start testing it myself a bit more. So I used this service, which you may have come across, which is awesome, it's now called Windy TV. It's formerly it's now windy.com. It's formerly windy.tv. And it's a live map of the world with all the wind patterns and rain patterns and pressure and whatnot, and gives you a real-time view of the weather. Excuse me, because what I realized was that if you use static data, maybe you've all encountered this too, sometimes when you use static data for something that is actually real in the world, that static data, when you amend it yourself, generates values that aren't actually realistic. I mean, you can't have rain when it's sunny. You get the idea, right? So I actually had to use real weather data to test it. So I had to test the extremities of it. I had to test what happens when there's a hurricane, what happens when it's -40 and howling with wind, and that kind of actually allowed me to give it a bit more breadth and to bring it to life a bit more. So what do you do after that? Well, you test again, because I'd only asked a few people and they'd given me some good steers, but now I really wanted to know, how it works on different devices and what it's like for people that are not poring over it like I was. So I asked about 20 people to give me some feedback and some ideas, and at this point it was largely really positive, but again, it's amazing how many good ideas come out of people that aren't yourself experiencing something. So yeah, the first thing I did was listen to people making the case that even with the kind of cards which explain how it works, that it still wasn't visual enough. So I added some theming, so it changes color when the weather conditions are different, and Google Satellite View, so you can actually see where you are, and little things like can the form handle bad characters, which I'd kind of missed. I'm always putting nice, friendly, well-written place names in, but what happens if you put an @ in or something? I wanted people to be able to share it. So now when it loads a particular place, it actually gives you a hash URL, so you could share it with your mates, listen to the sound of Tromsø, if that makes sense, listen to the sound of London, listen to the weather of London. So, my first few tweets about it when I launched it were, links to things that were happening in real time. Tiny little bit about the tech, and then we can actually listen to it. So at this time, I threw those two tools in, and I know they're not cool anymore. Well, actually, Gulp probably gets a bit of a hard time, but it's actually still really awesome. But yeah, I probably would have just put Webpack in, because I could have done with some nice ways of handling the bundles. I use Postal. I kind of wish I had used some kind of store manager now, because I've got loads of objects, lots of stuff happening over time, and I need a good way of managing that. So yeah, I was basically just using PubSub, which it's okay, but it's kind of borderline. Any more complexity in it would be really nasty. But these are the only two external services I was using. Really, that's pretty much it. I mean, everything else is all the stuff I wrote myself. So I was quite pleased that I'd kept all the dependencies down to a minimum, and obviously these two are just build tools. So I'll just quickly explain to you the application logic. This is what I should have started with, folks. So first thing to ask is there web audio? Because you're not going to enjoy this if your browser doesn't support it, right? It's game over. So I'm going to show an error if you haven't got that. Thankfully, most browsers do. So I'm going to show a ready state at this point. And then three things could happen. I could have actually put a URL in, like you saw in the tweet, and that would start the whole thing off. You could enter a place yourself, which we'll do in a minute, and you can just press play my weather. And then what we do is we check whether you're actually still online or not, which would be a weird thing to do in an application at that point if all user experiences were linear like that. But obviously, you know, anything could have happened, you know, or you might come back to it, you might be on a train, you know, we all understand the merits of managing that situation, right? So basically, let's assume that you are. Then it can actually start doing its work, and it can get the location or reverse geocode, get the satellite image, and then put some data in the local storage, which is obviously really important because that's what we're going to use if you are offline. And yeah, there's the logic for using the local storage. And if that fails, then there is some static data. So if you go offline and you haven't already loaded a location, I've got some music for you anyway. From London 2016 or whenever it was, I captured it. And then, yeah, we just configure the sounds. And interestingly for me, I used a web worker the first time because loading all those cards, the cards that explain how it works, were taking up precious performance that I need for the web audio, which is not always that performant on slower devices. So I basically let the web worker handle that, and when that's finished sorting out all the visuals for me, I load them into the application, and we actually hear some music. Woo! So we should probably listen to some, right? Yeah. So before I take any requests, I'm just going to play the weather of here and now. Quite mellow. It's quite mellow outside. Okay, so we can listen to this for a little while, or Jamaica. Is that spelled correctly? Better not be. Otherwise, I need to be shot. Right. It's raining. There's little twinkles. That means it's raining. So a couple of little points that I just wanted to finish with. So yeah, I haven't done any work on it for a couple of months because I needed a break, but I have still got some plans for it. What I'd like to do, if I somehow negotiate a sabbatical from work, is to actually hook it up to a real weather station. And have it play the music or generate the music in real time. And yeah, and I kind of want to hook up with some arts organizations or museums or venues that might put it on. There was a place in the Netherlands that had an art exhibition where they hosted it along with loads of other experimental music technology that you could play with. So that was really nice, got lots of good feedback about that. So yeah, I kind of want it to tour a little bit. And yeah, obviously, if anyone here has got any suggestions or wants to fork it or talk to me about some kind of strange collaboration, then I'd love to hear about it. So yeah, that's it from me. Thank you very much for listening.